Did you know that Chenin Blanc has been cultivated in South Africa for almost 360 years? The first 3 grapes documented to have been brought into South Africa were Semillon, Palomino and Chenin Blanc back in 1655. Of course, back then they were called Fransdryf, Groendryf and Steen. Of course, how Chenin Blanc came to be called Steen is a story that miraculously manages to be both boring and confusing. But if you care enough about that, then drop a comment below and I will tell that story in a separate post later on. Now, the reason we're talking about Chenin Blanc today is because today's hand drink solar wine of the day is the Roodekrantz 1983 Swartland Chenin Blanc. Called as such because it is made with fruit from a vineyard in the Swartland that was planted in 1983, which incidentally is the same year that Mario Brothers was first released as a game in arcade format, and it was also the year in which Return of the Jedi grossed almost $500 million at the box office around the world. The Roodekrantz team is led by the father and son team of Marius Burger Sr. and Marius Burger Jr. And these guys are the real deal. They are the archetypal, respectful family unit. They are softly spoken, super measured in their responses and in conversation, and just abundantly sincere. And I suppose it makes total sense that their wines are all of those things as well. And what's cooler about Roodekrantz is that when you look at their wine range as a whole, it manages to somehow be both super focused, but simultaneously an extreme masterclass in diversity, or at least in the versatility of Chenin Blanc as a cultivar. And when I say versatility, I'm not talking about the fact that Chenin can be a dry wine or a sweet wine or a sparkling wine, or it can be distilled. No, what I'm saying in this case is that within the genre of dry white wine, through some really gentle and meticulous winemaking on the part of winemaker Dani Morkel, the Roodekrantz range manages to lay this kind of platform for the ultimate exploration of the nuances expressed through Chenin Blanc in some of the major winemaking regions across the South African winelands. As I said earlier, this platform of exploration is made possible partially by winemaker Dani Morkel's decision to engage in more gentle winemaking techniques for this wine range, but it's also made possible through the way that Roodekrantz lay their range out. So they have 2 single-site old vine Chenin Blancs from Paarl, and then they have 2 old vine single-site Chenin Blancs from Stellenbosch. Well, one of them is in the range and one is in the wings waiting to see if it'll be released. And then they have 3 old vine single-site Swartland Chenin Blancs. So when you taste your way through their rather expansive range of single-site Chenin Blancs, not only do you get to enjoy all the texture and power and concentration that seems to come from a lot of old vine sites, but you also get the unapologetic character from each region. For example, Paarl is one of South Africa's hotter wine regions. So when you drink the Paarl Chenin Blancs, they are unapologetically rich and ripe and layered. Now, if you're a wine drinker who likes your Chenin Blancs to be lean and mean, well, then you wouldn't go hunting for them in Paarl. But you learn this all through drinking this amazing range from Roodekrantz. At this point, you may protest that, hang on, the Swartland is a hot wine region, so how can so many Swartland Chenin Blancs have liveliness and freshness and natural acidity? Well, the answer in the case of Roodekrantz is twofold. First of all, the sites that they've chosen are all grown in decomposed granite soils. There does seem to be a fairly broadly accepted notion by South African winemakers that decomposed granite soils are correlated with wines with a more pronounced freshness or acidity. The second reason, again particular to the vineyards chosen by Roodekrantz, is that they seem to receive a lot of those cooling afternoon winds, which can then slow down ripening a little bit and protect those vines from the admittedly very hot Swartland afternoons. But the beauty is that all these discussions and thoughts and questions come out as you work through their range. So I really cannot overstate how fascinating it is to work through all their wines. If you've been watching some of our other videos, you'll know that we've been doing a little bit of a Swartland slice-up where we look at each of the wards individually and go into their topography and their soil. But the fruit for this particular wine comes from a vineyard that falls just outside the Paarl. So technically it can only be bottled as wine of origin Swartland. But it should be noticed that the fruit for this 1983 Chenin Blanc comes from the exact same vineyard from which the rather famous Roodekrantz Renosterbos Rug Chenin Blanc is produced. When we look at how the wine is made, it is 90% fermented in stainless steel tank. But what's really interesting is that the last 10% is in fact taken from the Roodekrantz wine. And so that's made in a barrel fermented style, a lot more oxidatively, and it's also harvested a lot earlier. So when they mix that 10% portion in, you might think, well, that's not a very big component. But Marius Berger Jr. was explaining to me that when you take that more oxidatively made wine and you take that small parcel and drop it into the more protected wine making style, it has a far greater influence on the wine than the 10% would imply, because it triggers a whole bunch of oxidative reactions which introduce these really interesting savory and sometimes more textured compounds that completely transform the character of the wine, but without losing the freshness that you got from a protective stainless steel tank fermentation. Now, I'm on the very edge of my understanding of the organic chemistry, so I don't even know if that's a thing, but it sounds amazing. Now, sometimes sounding amazing is not enough, and that's why we have to get into the glass to see if it actually tastes amazing. When we give it a sniff, well, I mean, you get all of the elements that have made Swartland Chenin Blanc famous. You've got rich, ripe stone fruit. You've got extroverted queen pineapple notes. I mean, there definitely is some herbal, fragrant honeybush. There's even a touch of fennel, perhaps. And then there's a leesy texture as well. There's some, well, not texture, but aroma. There's oatmeal, kind of some malty notes, and a little bit of dusty gravel, just for good measure. And when we give this guy a sip, well, the first thing that strikes me is how the fruit manages to be genuinely ripe, as the nose implied, but without ever being cloying. Now, the first reason for this is because, as is so often the case with some of the better Swartland Chenins, these ripe pineapple and peach and apricot fruit notes are kind of woven through with far more savory, almost like sea salt flake elements, which really break up the fruit and deliver it in a far more manageable format. Secondly, a combination of the fact that they are old vines and that there's also extended lees contact in the winemaking means that there's just so much chewy texture going on that it totally couches those fruit notes in a far more interesting form. So one might almost go so far as to say that the actual texture of the wine is more important than the flavor, but this is one particular Chenin Blanc that has oodles of fruit flavor with oodles of texture. And that's really what makes it such a fantastic wine. So that is all we have time for today, but if you have any questions about Roodekrantz or about Chenin Blanc in the Swartland, then drop those questions onto the website and I'll get back to you. If you enjoyed the video, then consider supporting us on Patreon and subscribe to the Hendrik Solo YouTube channel, because we publish 6 videos every month that talk about things like wine science, wine history, unusual cultivars, and some of the rising winemaking stars that are coming out of the dynamic South African winelands.